Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 7 Muscular System lecture for FVA Essentials of Healthcare. This will be the first half of this presentation, and as we begin this unit about muscles, we need to talk about the muscle attachments and functions. First of all, there are over 650 muscles in the body. That's a lot. And for this course, I'm going to show you through the innerbody.com website and diagrams which ones I want you to focus on. When you get to college, you're going to go a little bit more in depth. But the way muscles work is they really need to be attached to bones for leverage. And we're going to talk about what that means and a little bit about origin and insertion. And I put this picture here of two red circles for the bicep muscle. And you can see right here in this red circle, they are attached to a bone and then they insert on another bone. And that means when the muscle contracts, which is literally the pulley, it shortens and it pulls this bone over here to that bone over there. So the real key word is contractile. It shortens to pull and leverage a bone upon another bone. And this happens by tendons that are attached to bones. So the very ends of a muscle, which are white, are called tendons, and they attach muscle to bone. Now, we also have three main responsibilities of muscles. Body heat to maintain body temperature. So they do give off heat when they work out. That's why you're sweat and you're hot when you are working out in the cold and you have steam coming off you. Body movement, which is probably the most important, let's be honest. If we don't have muscles, flexing, contracting, we don't move. And then body form and shape to maintain posture. So when you're just sitting down, some of your muscles are maintaining contracture in order for you to keep your position. Now, when we talk a little bit more about those muscle attachments, origin is literally where the muscle starts. So if you're looking down here on the bicep muscle, okay, it starts up at the shoulder, but it literally inserts, which is the other end of that muscle, it inserts on the radius, which means if that muscle shortens, it's going to be pulling on that radius to bring the forearm up, and that's how we flex our bicep. In contrast, here is your calf muscle, also known as your gastrocnemius. It attaches behind your knee at your femur and all the way down to your heel. So it helps you push your, feet down, and you can do a calf raise on it. But if you keep your legs straight when you try to stretch your hamstring, you'll notice that you also stretch this muscle because it's attached behind your knee. And the belly is known as the meat, the red area that you see in both of these muscles that is actually contractile. The white part, the tendon, doesn't really stretch a lot, but the red part does. Now, in every muscle, we have a prime mover and every muscle group, we have a prime mover, antagonist, and a synergist. The prime mover produces the movement in the single direction. So in these two pictures, the biceps helps produce elbow flexion, flexing your bicep, right? And your gastrocnemius helps produce calf raises, and your antagonist is in the opposite direction. So for this arm right here, your tricep is the antagonist. It helps move your elbow in the opposite direction, where a synergist helps to kind of help a muscle in the right direction. And your brachioradialis, which you see right down here, helps your bicep move in the right direction. So if you want to think about prime movers and antagonists, think about Superman and Bizarro. They're kind of opposites, where a synergist helps the prime mover move in the right direction, just assists with it. Now, if we're going to talk about a muscle contraction, I put these series of pictures here because, to be honest, it starts in the brain. We decide usually that we want to do a contraction or move something, it moves down this axon to the muscle area, and that happens through an action potential. But this happens so quickly, it's almost like nanoseconds for all this to happen in conjunction. But if we slow it down, what really happens is there is a higher concentration of sodium ions, Na+, which are on the outside of a axon that you can see right here. And there's a higher concentration of potassium ions inside. And when we have this thought process, you can see that they switch positions to keep an action potential moving. Now, we will talk much more about this when we go over, neurons and the CNS and the PNS of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. But I wanted to give you that information, that verbiage right now, so you understand how they're connected and linked. Now, in order for a muscle to contract, it's going to need an ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, and it requires oxygen, glucose, and other material brought through blood. But then it's also going to need a nerve impulse, which, again, that comes from the action potential that starts in our brain. And the motor neuron or unit is going to help keep that fiber stimulated with that action potential. It's almost like a road to send that impulse to the right spot, which is called a neuromuscular junction. And this is where the motor axon and the sacrolemma of the muscle, which is like the sheath around it, kind of meet together to transfer that signal. And we look at this next slide right here, or this next picture, you can see from the spinal cord, this motor nerve hits the muscle fibers on the outside sheath, which is called a sacrolemma. And this is called a neuromuscular junction, where the signal is being handed off from nerve tissue to muscle tissue. Now, the end of the axon and where the actual sarcolemma is, this is called a synaptic cleft or neuromuscular junction. And there is something called acetylcholine that is released. This chemical that's released helps to transmit the nerve impulse of what to do. And what's crazy is that you look at this little junction right here and these little molecules or something are moving. This is happening so fast, y'all. Like, think about right now trying to snap your fingers and how quickly that happened and how slow this picture looks. But literally, the sacrolemma becomes temporarily permeable to sodium ions, which rush into the muscle cell. And as we talked about, the literal action potential, it creates this chain wave of impulse that continues the momentum of that impulse from our brain out to a muscle. Now, the more we exercise, what do we also lose? Think about when you're exercising, you're running, you're lifting weights, what do you lose? Well, sweat. And what do you think's in sweat? Do you think it's potassium or do you think it's sodium? Well, Na plus is what? K plus is what? Na plus is sodium. That's salt. Your sweat is usually salty, and you're losing that the more you exercise. Where potassium is usually from bananas and stuff. So if you want to ever cut a cramp, honestly, these are your best bets. Salt afterwards when you're having a cramp is great, but potassium beforehand helps to prevent the cramp from happening. So now you can kind of understand why people talk about salt or pickles or mustard and why people talk about bananas, because it's literally part of the impulse process when our muscles are contracting. Now, we have multiple types of muscles in our body, and they are called skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. And I put this picture up here of these steaks because if you look at the way skeletal, smooth, and cardiac muscle work, well, they kind of look like different cuts of steak. And of course, I'm not telling you I want to be a cannibal. This is just a funny meme from, I think it's called like 990 or something like that. But let's be honest. If you look at the cuts of muscle in the human body, there's skeletal, which looks very striated, smooth, which almost looks like cells, and then cardiac that looks almost like skeletal, but it's definitely involuntary and looks a little bit different. So we're going to talk about each one of these types of muscles. Skeletal muscle. Biggest part about skeletal muscle is that they're usually voluntary. Now, granted, we do have reflexes, but at the same time, it's still a quick impulse that tells us that we need to do something quickly. And so when you look at how these are operated, they come in a bundle. That's why I put flow from the bundles right here. They come in a bundle, which is that sacrolemma, and then they have these individual bundles with individual muscle fibers within. Now, there's multinucleated muscle cells. Each muscle cell is known as a muscle fiber, and we really control these. We decide when we want to flex, when we want to use these muscles for sure. The next set is smooth muscles, and these are definitely involuntary, which means we don't control them. They act as their own, they act very slowly, they don't tire easily, where our biceps and big muscles certainly tire easily the more we use them. These are controlled by their automatic nervous system. You can find them in internal organs. In fact, you find these in arteries, and you can see that like this little muscle cell almost looks like a squirt bottle. And I know it's cringe, but look at this ketchup bottle over here that's squirting out ketchup. But that's basically how it like squishes stuff from one area to another. They're not attached to bones. They operate in our organs and intestines and arteries and stuff. But you can see how they contract, they squeeze stuff through, just like this ketchup bottle is squeezing ketchup, and our arteries might be squeezing blood. Now, cardiac muscle is also involuntary. And if you guessed it from your super dense knowledge of medical terminology, cardiac means heart. And when you talk about the cardiovascular system, you're talking about the heart, cardiac, vascular, which is veins and arteries and blood flow, and how it gets pumped all over the place. And it does look like smooth muscle, but it looks more connected and does have those more canals, like not like the smooth muscles, but this does have an electrical impulse. And I put this little picture of a electrical heart here because when we get into cardiac, there's a whole unit about the cardiac system and vascular system, that there is a electrical impulse that continues to keep our heart beating. Because how many times does our heart beat per minute? Well, thank goodness it's involuntary, because it literally beats 60 to 100 beats per minute. Imagine if you had to think about that. Every minute beating your heart 60 to 80 times. That would be hard. We're very fortunate that is involuntary, and that means that it does it for us and we don't have to worry about that. If we had to think about it, I might forget, to be honest. There is one other group of muscles that we need to talk about that don't fit in the other ones, and they're called sphincters or dilator muscles. And these are definitely circular muscles, and the most common places are openings. So between the esophagus and the stomach, we have an opening. The stomach and the small intestine, the other end, we have a small opening. We also have it around our anus and urethra and our mouth. So I put this picture of a dam because our mouth, eyes, anus, urethra, we can actually control that contraction. If you look at the pictures right here on the face, around your eyes, around your mouth, you can actually control that being tighter or looser and controlling the flow of things through there. So let's do a real quick assessment of who's that Pokemon. Name the muscle type clearly. We have three different muscle types. One looks very cellular, if you will. One looks very rigid, and then one looks like it's in between. So this first one right here, if you guessed it right, that looks like it's in between these two, is actually cardiac. Notice how it's similar to this one, but not so much of this other cellular one. And the most rigid one is always going to be skeletal, which leaves the one that looks like cells the most as smooth muscle. Now that you know a little bit about the anatomy and cellular makeup of every muscle, let's talk about characteristics of muscles. Now, I put these two memes up there because as much as we want to laugh at both these guys who are probably the same guy, to be honest, they're doing very dynamic workouts. And if you want your life to go on for a long time, great longevity, resistance training is better. I put the meme in the middle because I literally work out so that I can just eat more. And if you want to judge me, I don't care. But for bone density, mobility of the body, this will always be better, even though it looks crazy, will always be better than just cardio, running and walking. I guarantee it. So, contractibility, the first characteristics of muscle. This means that the muscle can shorten or contract, and it reduces the distance between two parts. So, when you flex your bicep, you see the mass builds up right here. Okay? That means that you're pulling your forearm towards your shoulder, and that's what lets this actually bulk up. But when you're looking at smooth muscle, it causes the muscles to kind of decrease in diameter, kind of like these water bottles that are being crimped up, where skeletal muscle, when it contracts, it looks bigger, it's more dense. But smooth muscle does not work the same way. It looks like it's actually thinner and just serves a purpose. Excitability or irritability, this is basically just muscles and nervous system cells being able to react together. And that means that when you think of something, there is an impulse that sends out to the body, and then our body decides to move. And that's through those action potentials that we talked about, or impulses. So this is just a characteristic of muscles to receive signals from a nerve or a response, and we react. So how do you react when you're scared? Well, one time when I was in college, I received a fingerprint or prick in an anatomy course, and instantly I couldn't even react or control myself. I just cussed. I just started saying the F bomb as many times as I could, and it was legit reaction. And even though these pictures say think, impulse, move, sometimes it's so quick that we can't even think about it, and we just react however our body or mind thinks to react. So extensibility is another characteristic of muscles, and this just allows our muscles to be stretched. So you can see this guy has great flexibility, so his muscles are being stretched. This guy's face is being stretched, right? And if you don't want to do this with your muscles, well, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be inflexible. Your body will rust up. You won't be able to have high mobility and move a lot. And so this is why yoga, no joke, is one of the best literal things that we can do with our bodies to prevent rust and to prevent poor flexibility. One of the last characteristics of muscles is elasticity. That means that even though we stretch something out, it can return to its original shape. Where extensibility is that it just can be lengthened. Elasticity, just like this rubber band right here, stretches out and then goes back to its original form. Now, what's crazy to see in injuries sometimes is that this shows how elastic muscles are because in certain injuries, we see the rubber band effect. This is Aaron Rodgers, who in this picture right here, you can see how bent his ankle is, and he tore his Achilles tendon, and you could see the slingshot, like this rubber band, sling back up into his calf. And recently, Deshaun Watson had the same injury, and this is just a picture, but you can go find it on Twitter, where he tried to push off, just like Aaron Rodgers here in this very hyperflexed ankle position, and you can see how elastic muscles are because it slingshotted back into his calf. Yes, it was nasty to watch, but it just really illuminates how elastic the muscle bellies are. And when you tear it, you can see the slingshot effect. Now, when we talk about muscle tone in all muscles, muscles are always partially contracted. That helps posture. And the more exercise you do, like this guy right over here who thinks he's a hoss, and nutrition, you keep them in that good state. Now, anytime a muscle is contracted and shortened, we're talking about an isotonic contraction. So this guy is doing isotonic contractions where his bicep is shortening to produce that movement. And isometric is when you're creating a force, but the length doesn't change. So if he held that position, you see his leg right there, he is not moving that leg, but it might still be contracted. So the muscles are tensing, but they're not moving. So that's the big difference between an isotonic and an isometric. Isotonic, there's movement, and muscles are contracting and shortening. Isometric, the muscles are not moving, but there's still a contraction that keeps them hard. Now, atrophy and hypertrophy are two issues with muscles that we'll talk about maybe a little bit more in our disorders. But atrophy is when you have an issue or an injury and your muscle will shrink because you're not using it. Whereas hypertrophy is the muscle size increases due to overexercise. I put these two pictures down here because, oh my gosh, these are not natural. This is called synthol, y'all. This same guy, I think it is, have injected a chemical into their muscles to make them look larger, but they are clearly ballooning, which is fake. So that brings up a question. How do we exercise for muscle tone? How do we exercise for endurance? How do we exercise for growth? Well, for hypertrophy, what this guy wanted to achieve, but he did the fake way of, injecting a bad substance into his body, you want to literally go between 6 to 10 reps, 1 to 2 minute rest intervals, and you really want to go higher weight. If you can get past 12 reps, you're not doing enough weight. But if you just want to be strong and have muscle tone, then you should be thinking between 1 and 5, more rest, and you're almost training movements. So squatting, maybe deadlifts, those are some very big exercises, big muscle groups, and you're almost looking for power too. But hypertrophy, which is muscles looking bigger, you should be doing more reps, higher weight, and if you can get to 12, then you're doing too little weight. But true strength comes from the big body exercises and less reps. Endurance would be more than 12 and less weight. So the more reps, the better with less weight. But it's always about doing the correct exercise in the correct movement. But all these muscles are here to literally pump you up, and we will go over the rest next week. Thanks.